Hi, thanks for tuning in. In this set of tutorials, I'm going to talk about one of my favorite all-time techniques in underwater photography, close focus wide angle. It sounds kind of complicated, but it really is not at all if you keep a few basic principles in mind. I'm not a professional, I have a day job, I do this as a hobby, and I have taken my share of bad pictures. But I have been able to get some really cool shots, some of which I will be happy to share with you. It's all about perspective and depth, and it's really cool, and I will show you why. First of all, what is close focus wide angle? It's a technique where you have a camera with a wide angle lens and you get very close to your foreground subject. Less than 2 feet, sometimes much closer. The foreground subject fills a large portion of the frame of the image, okay? There's also, however, some objects in the background, a diver, a reef, another animal, a boat. And what results is, first of all, you see an enlarged, often dramatic view of the near subject and the environment that it's in. You see context. You also might have multiple subjects, something in the foreground, and 1 or 2 or even more subjects in the background. My favorite being marine life in the foreground with one of my dive buddies in the background. And finally, you can exaggerate perspective. You can see depth and great, tremendous dimension, which really results in really cool shots with high impact. You can exaggerate the size of the subject in the foreground or maybe just a feature of the subject in the foreground. You get high apparent depth of field with a wide angle lens and a relatively small aperture, so that allows good focus of the foreground subject and the background subject. In some of the subsequent tutorials, I'm going to talk about equipment. Guess what? You don't need a big old expensive SLR with 2 big bulky strobes. You can get some cool shots with a simple point and shoot camera, and I'll show you some examples of this. I'm also going to have a tutorial where I show a demonstration of perspective distortion and why you really do need to get very close to the foreground subject. I'll have a tutorial to explain how to achieve proper focus and lighting, which can be a little tricky, but really not really if you have a few basic principles in mind. And then we'll have a tutorial talking about composition, things you kind of strive for and some pitfalls to avoid. And then finally, I'm going to show quite a few examples and critiques of my own pictures, some bad, hopefully a few good, of cool shots of close focus wide angle. Let me just show a few quick examples to demonstrate what I'm talking about. Okay, let's just take a look at a few quick examples. This is a picture I took of my wife sitting on her table with a plastic frog about 3 feet in front of her. I was about 4 feet away with my Canon compact point and shoot camera when I took this shot, slightly zoomed up. Then I zoomed all the way out so the lens was as wide as possible. No external wide angle attachment though, and you can see a picture of me being only about 6 to 8 inches away from the subject in the foreground, which is the plastic frog, and my wife again about 3 or 4 feet behind, same position as the other picture. So as you recall, the first picture looked like this when I was about 4 feet away from the frog, but the second picture, look at this. In my opinion, that is just so much more cool. The frog pops out at you. It looks huge. You get perspective distortion. The frog looks dynamic. It looks so much larger than my wife, who's only about 3 or 4 feet away. Now you'll also notice that the frog is sharp. I focused on the frog, and my wife is a few feet away. She isn't tack sharp, but she's still pretty clear, and that's because we have very good apparent depth of field if we keep our aperture small and if we shoot with a relatively wide angle lens. I just think this technique, close focus wide angle, is so cool. I'll show you a couple more examples. So here's an image of a lionfish in the foreground. I've got the context of the environment, the reef that it's on, a few other fishes, and I've got 2 dive buddies in the background at various distances behind it. Pretty cool. This is a picture showing how you can get an exaggerated feature of something, of a part of an animal. This is a trumpetfish sort of looking toward me, but look at how large its mouth and its head looks compared to the rest of its body, which is still in relatively good focus, again because of the good apparent depth of field. And you can also see part of the reef, and you go back toward the water, you can see the undersurface, so it gives you depth and dimension. Here's an example, snorkeling in Roatan in sort of a mangrove swamp. I got some, with a wide-angle lens and a dome port and an SLR camera with no strobes, I got some pictures of the roots kind of with acting as leading lines, going toward the surface and then guiding our attention to the surface, where you can get through Snell's window some of the blue sky, and you can even see some trees and our little mangrove hut there through Snell's window. Pretty cool. And again, my most favorite is to go close to a subject in the foreground, in this case a southern stingray, and you get a picture of the environment which it's in, a dynamic picture enough in itself, but we also have my dive buddy in the background. I just think it's so cool. Okay, well that concludes this introduction tutorial on close focus wide angle. Please check out the subsequent tutorials on this topic. I think the close focus wide angle technique is really, really cool, and it's something you're going to want to check out. Thanks for tuning in.